Given to that, I will turn it over to Preston Jordan, who will take it from here.
Thanks, Will. So besides looking at produced water handling disposition, we also looked at the hazard of release of hydraulic fracturing fluid directly through the subsurface. So this would be, for instance, leakage via a well during the hydraulic fracturing operation. So this is the map. It has the same groundwater coverage that you saw before, where the blue represents high quality groundwater. What's different about this map is that the fields are outlined with a color, and those fields have hydraulic fracturing in them, or at least a record of hydraulic fracturing. And the color represents the minimum depth of a well that was hydraulically fractured in that field that we found. So the fields that are outlined in red had a well that was shallower than 300 meters, or about 1,000 feet, that was hydraulically fractured, and then so on and so forth from there. So this is covering the southern San Joaquin Valley and the Santa Maria area, Ventura, and Los Angeles. So one of the data gaps is that, at least for the San Joaquin Valley, there isn't good information on the vertical distribution of the quality of groundwater. So there's currently utilization of the shallow groundwater, which is higher quality, and then there's oil production activities much deeper, and there isn't a lot of information in between those two domains. So one of the concerns with shallow fracturing is the possibility of fracturing directly into groundwater. So we actually looked in the Los Angeles basin and some of the fields in that basin that are hydraulically fractured, because there's a little bit better information there in terms of the vertical distribution of groundwater. And so these are 5 fields in the Los Angeles basin that were hydraulically fractured. And we looked up in the well records how shallow the shallowest fracturing occurred in those fields in the vicinity of a water well. And so I'll run through this various information. The blue coloring at the top is somewhat schematically representative of high quality groundwater. That's groundwater that could be used directly without much treatment. And that kind of aqua or green color, depending upon your color vision, is water that would need some treatment but is still required to be protected under underground injection control regulations. And then the brown or tan color is water that is so salty that it's not required to be protected. That heavy black horizontal line in each field is the uppermost depth that was fractured from a well. And so you can see for the Inglewood field, the scale on the left side is in 500 meter increments. So in the Inglewood field, you can see there was a hydraulic fracturing operation that was within about 100 meters of the base of protected water. And then in the Montebello field, it's 1,000 or more meters. So you can see it varies quite a bit. In the Whittier field, there's actually fracturing within water that would otherwise be considered protected. However, when water of good quality co-occurs with oil under the underground injection control program, which is not what regulates hydraulic fracturing, but by analogy, that water is exempted from protection because it's a mineral resource. And so under underground injection control regulation, that water is exempted from protection. Now, again, that doesn't have to do with hydraulic fracturing. But the fact that that fracturing is occurring in water of that quality, even if there is oil in that particular zone, does raise concern that there might be other nearby zones that don't have oil that also have that high quality water.
Just a quick question before you move on.
Sure.
So as you get deeper and deeper into the ground, the water has higher salinity?
That's not 100% always true, but it's generally true, yes. As you go deeper, the salinity tends to go up. The groundwater is older, if you will. It's had a longer residence time. More minerals have dissolved into the water.
And could you explain this? I understand that this Playa del Rey bar has this enormous white gap in the middle. Could you just let me know what's going on there? That's in my district. So.
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, absolutely. So in that case, the data points that we used for the vertical distribution are indicated by the dashed horizontal lines. And so you can see for Playa del Rey, we had information on where the 3,000 milligrams per liter, which is a measurement of salinity. We had a depth for that. And then the next steepest measurement we had was at 22,000. And so we did not want to basically grade schematically the quality of the groundwater between those two, because the depth difference was so great that we thought it would be misleading. So instead, we said, okay, that's just terra incognita, and that would be a location where more information would be needed. And I know that the Division of Oil and...
Data gap.
Yeah, it's just a data gap. Yeah. I mean, all of these could potentially be refined more. What we were most interested in was if we could reasonably bracket where the 10,000 milligram per liter boundary is, because that's the salinity, that's the upper salinity for water that is required to be protected under underground injection control. So for the other fields, we felt we could bracket that reasonably.
Just a generic comment, Senator Allen reminded me that one of the challenges when we're overdrafting our groundwater basins, we're left with the water quality down at the bottom part that's left, that is increasing in salinity that potentially would be unusable. And so, if you've, dropped down 1/4 of your groundwater basin, and the last half is, you're increasing the salinity, and pretty soon it will be not worthy of using on crops.
Well, I guess for the purpose of this, we've been having this discussion about the reinjection of wastewater. For the purposes of that discussion, let's say the Montebello line, what would the salinity level be considered for the purposes of legal reinjection? Does it depend on how deep you reinject the water? Because you've got different levels of salinity at different depths.
Right, so my understanding of the underground injection control program is that a salinity greater than 10,000
Right.
TDS is required for a zone to be permitted for injection. And so to the extent that that depth varies, it's not depth, there's nothing in the regulation that says it has to be a certain depth. What guides where it can be injected is the quality of the water. So the
You have to go deeper.
you have to go deep enough that the water quality is poor enough that it's not required to be protected under federal code. Am I answering your question? I'm not.
Yeah, though I'm trying to think about the science of the connection. I mean, how fluid the movement of water is within a...
Right, so yeah, what is not shown on here is it's what you call the hydrostratigraphy, which is this geologic structure in the subsurface. So the code also requires what's called zonal isolation, which is that when water is injected into a particular zone, that there's overlying low permeability rock that will keep that water from upwelling and impacting shallower waters. So it's more complicated than just the salinity. There also has to be a geologic setting that is appropriate for that water to be injected into. And then none of that is shown on here.
Does the fracking process compromise that impermeability when you're fracking a little higher up?
So I think that's for us one of the main questions in data gaps for the shallow fracturing. I mean, in general, the industry does not design the fractures to fracture into overlying impermeable rock. They try not to do that because the fractures cost money, and fracturing into impermeable rock that's overlying the zone that they're targeting is not necessarily beneficial to them. But we do have questions about what is the maximum extent that a fracture can propagate within the shallow domain in California.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to continue.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Our clock is ticking, and
Yeah, so actually I think
thank you.
I covered some of this already, that one of our recommendations is to obviously protect groundwater from shallow hydraulic fracturing, and there is some research in the rest of the country on the maximum vertical extent of fractures, but because the fracturing operations in California are so different in terms of depth and type, we see a data gap in researching what is the maximum vertical extent of fracturing in the state. So going on to atmospheric emissions. So these charts regard greenhouse gas emissions, and across the bottom is segments the fields into the two different categories on the left are the ones to focus on. Across the bottom, this scale is how much greenhouse pollution is released essentially per barrel of oil that's produced. And this is the amount of greenhouse pollution that's released during the production. So not the burning of the oil, but actually the effort to produce the oil, which itself takes energy. The plot on the left is for fields that have some significant amount of hydraulic fracturing in them. And the plot in the middle is for fields that do not have a significant amount of hydraulic fracturing. So if you look at the scale on the bottom, for fields that have hydraulic fracturing, there's no fields that have sort of that middle to high amount of greenhouse pollution per barrel, whereas fields that are not hydraulically fractured, there are some fields in that case.
Is that because it's so deep down?
We think that's due to a number of factors. In part, it's because it's deep down. There's a correlation between how viscous the oil is and the depth of the oil occurs at. So deeper oil tends to be less viscous. It's easier to produce, so it takes less energy to produce. Also, a lot of oil, most of the oil that's produced in the state is produced by injecting steam. And that's a shallower oil that's highly viscous and it needs to be heated up so it will flow to the well. And obviously producing steam requires a massive amount of energy. And the energy source usually is natural gas combustion for doing that. And so that releases greenhouse pollutants.
And I'm sorry, I don't understand this graph. What is the horizontal axis?
So the horizontal axis is the amount of greenhouse pollution per barrel in production. So in order to produce a barrel of oil from a particular field, that's the amount of greenhouse pollution that's produced.
And then
to get that barrel out.
This is a distribution of.
Is a distribution for. So each, on the left side is the fraction of fields in that category that have that emission factor.
Oh, good question.
So there was one detail. We think that the data that's available is available field by field from the Air Resources Board. It's not really available for different production methods. And so we think it would be useful for the Air Resources Board to actually look at the greenhouse pollution intensity for different oil production methods rather than strictly field by field.
Can I ask, is this data compared to, are you looking at fractured versus non-fractured wells trying to go after the same kind of formations? I mean,
No.
You know, the other possible reason is just simply that if they are, you know, that they're going after different kind of formations, and that there may be some of these formations that are easier to reach with less GHG production or less energy production. I mean, wouldn't you have to really definitively say this, wouldn't you have to compare wells that are going after the same kind of formation or at least the same kind of depth and geology?
Yes, although the amount of energy that is used for drilling and installing a well pales in comparison to the amount of energy that's used in, say, water flood injection or steam injection. So that could be a factor, but I would say it's a fairly secondary factor, speaking strictly about that component.
So your explanation is not that it is lower GHGs than traditional drilling, but it's lower GHGs than the other enhanced extraction techniques like steam injection.
Right, which is...
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is most of the oil that's, because oil production in the state's been going on for a century, most of the oil that's produced uses some method other than just drill a hole and oil comes up at this point. So moving on to land use, public health and habitat. This again goes back to what Dr. Feinstein was saying in terms of direct and indirect impacts. So this is obviously the Los Angeles Basin, and that the outlines are 2 kilometers in distance around active oil and gas wells. The red outlines are around wells that have been hydraulically fractured, and the black are around wells that have not been hydraulically fractured. And in the air research that was done, we did not find a strong signal that the emissions from hydraulically fractured wells were much greater than from non-hydraulically fractured wells. That said, there's not a great deal of research on that topic either. But this goes to the point that really looking at the entire oil and gas production system rather than just focusing on hydraulic fracturing might bring forth more information that would provide for science-based policy assessment. There are air pollutants that are emitted by oil and gas production, no doubt, but they tend to be relatively small with a few exceptions compared to total emissions across the basin. But we did not find good data measuring those concentrations of those pollutants as you approach an individual well or an individual oil field. And so that raises question about is there, and if there is, what is the extent of any health hazard for communities living within close proximity of active oil and gas wells? So in addition to measuring those air concentrations in the vicinity, close vicinity of oil and gas wells, we're also recommending that public health should be assessed near oil and gas production to try to get a better handle on what effect, if any, there is. In terms of habitat, these 4 pictures show different well densities. In the upper left is an area with no wells, and then the well density increases to the lower right. And studies have found that up to a certain high well density, there can be sufficient habitat for wildlife and vegetation to persist. But obviously, as the well density goes up, that habitat becomes increasingly fragmented or disconnected into smaller and smaller patches. And then at that highest well density, there's so little habitat left that really most species can no longer subsist. However, in the study, we found that on that lower right photograph, typically only 1 out of some high number of wells was hydraulically fractured. And this is because in an oil field, they're typically producing from many different levels at the same time. And they might have many wells that are producing from a zone that does not require hydraulic fracturing, and then one zone that does require it. And so even if hydraulic fracturing didn't exist, for the most part, what we found through our analysis was that the habitat that is no longer available due to oil production probably would not be available. There are a few exceptions to that, but where the well density is high, it would be high whether or not hydraulic fracturing existed or not.
Sorry, I gotta ask a question. That seems to be in conflict with your assertion that seems to be in conflict with your assertion that in the report that there are much more wells that are possible to be drilled at all because of hydraulic fracturing. If less wells were possible to be drilled because they were not using enhanced extraction techniques, wouldn't you have less habitat loss simply by having fewer wells?
I think I could take that because this was my analysis. So this is largely a product of the fact that there's a threshold effect. So you're seeing that when there's no wells in that upper left-hand corner, the habitat is intact, and then there's gradual loss and fragmentation as the well density increases. Once you reach about 77 wells per square kilometer, the habitat is essentially gone.